So in this lecture, we will look at the creative economy and try and understand frameworks, how to think about creative economy as a whole. We have looked at the cultural pillar, we have looked at how culture connects with the creative economy, and we have also looked at creativity separately, and we have looked at what creativity means, but we'll draw in the creativity and economic pillars more prominently in this lecture here. What we'll try and look at is what are the pillars of the creative economy as a whole, the three pillars we have talked about. What are creative industries? And in this entire lecture, I'll use interchangeably few terms because really the boundaries of these are not very clear. So whether it is creative economy, cultural economy, creative industries, cultural industries, they're one and the same for the purpose of this class, this lecture here. So if I change between these, don't worry. What are the creative industries? How do we define them? What's in, what's not in? What's the significance of creative industries and creative economy? And why should you and I pay attention to the creative economy? Why is it so important now, right? Those are the things we'll try and understand, get a vocabulary that we can use for the rest of our course over here. So to begin with, we know that there are sort of three pillars of the creative economy: culture, creativity, and economics. Particularly, let's focus on creativity, right? And we have already watched the video by Professor Seelig on what creativity and innovation is. We have talked about that in class. What we want to see here is when it comes to attaching economics to creativity, how can we conceptualize creativity? And this is where we will go back to use the report by United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. That was one of the first initiatives for creative economy, worldwide, acknowledged, recognized, and the first report was published in 2010. We'll try and follow the vocabulary and language used in that particular report because it's useful in terms of to get us from the world of theory into the world of practice here. So what we really talk about is three forms of creativity. One is artistic creativity, which is, it's all about, in this case, you're not trying to apply creativity to solve a problem. Rather, you are getting into applying creativity for the purposes of imagination, coming up with original ideas, novel ways of interpreting and seeing the world around us. And often this manifests in the form of works of art that we have been talking for so long, right? They're expressed in those forms, just as you see this painting over here, for example. So artistic creativity often uses the right brain, as some might argue, and it is based in art and culture. The second form of creativity is scientific creativity, which is hypothesized on our curiosity for why the world is the way it is around us, right? So it's curiosity, and then you hypothesize. We are willing to go and test and run experiments to generate answers to why certain things are the way they are, or in other cases, we are trying to solve problems by hypothesizing, running experiments, and finding answers. So what you see here on the other side, and I will not play this video, is using how can we provide delivery of goods and services to people's home in a more efficient, which means reduced time for delivery from the time you place an order to getting things to your home, to as well as being cost efficient. So Amazon started this experiment a few years ago on using drones to make delivery to your homes. But the fact is you're trying to experiment and say that the technology exists, but can I put all these technologies together to formulate a solution that can work? So it's about scientific creativity. And the third part of creativity is what's called as economic creativity, which is how the innovation and creativity applied in the context of business. So improving your business models, coming up with new business models, coming up with new business practices that are really creative and with some goals in mind. For example, getting competitive advantage, or maybe solving a social and environmental issue, right? Coming up with a business idea to solve social, cultural, environmental issues. And more in the sharing economy, you're seeing innovation happening a lot. Shared economy, Airbnb, Uber, these are all new business models and business practices that are coming about. So those three forms of creativity are core for the creative economy. Of course, undergirding all these forms of creativity is core technological creativity, where certain forms of breakthroughs in technology happen, right, every so often. For example, more recently, it's been the advent of internet, 3D printing technologies, so on and so forth. But each one of them depends on some kind of technological innovation at the core of it. So these three forms of creativity are instrumental for the creative economy. But the question is, just by saying that creativity exists, are we going to experience new innovations coming about? And how do new innovations come about? The key thing to recognize here is that creativity by itself, creativity turning into innovation, is a social process. It's not the lone person sitting in isolation who is creating things, right? So even in the creative economy, to see new things happening, it's important that we recognize that different pieces come together, and it really is four forms of what is called as capitals that come together, and at the intersection of those four forms of capital, we see creativity and innovation happening. What are those four forms of capitals? Simple: human capital, which has to do with our knowledge, expertise, experience that we as individuals bring to the table. It's whether it's knowledge about robotic technologies, or it is knowledge about a certain form of weaving, which has been there for centuries in certain parts of the world. So it's a knowledge, expertise, skills that we bring to the table. That's human capital. Second piece that's important to produce innovation is social capital, which is the knowledge that resides in our extended networks and communities that we have. They might be place-based communities, virtual communities, in whatever form. But the key thing why this is important is that often innovation comes about when you're reaching out to somebody who is sort of a really distant connection of some form, and you have two very different forms of knowledge pieces coming together, and that's when sort of really new and innovative ideas come about. So we have to depend on the extended networks and knowledge and expertise that resides in these extended networks in order to have creative and innovative ideas coming about. So that's social capital. The third form is cultural capital, which is the knowledge and capabilities that exist in our communities through and have been passed on from generations in the form of culture and heritage and traditions, and which we see in the form of works of arts that have been around. But this is something that is implicit, comes through our values and beliefs, and have sort of fostered over the generations. It also changes, evolves over time. It's not static by any means. If you have more diverse populations in certain cities, the cultural capital of that region changes dynamically. So that is an important piece of innovation in the creative economy. And lastly, what's important is the institutional capital, which has to do with the environments we live with. What is the infrastructure that's available to us? What's the financial instruments and capital that is available for us to bring a creative idea to fruition, right? What are the laws and regulations that facilitate or hinder creativity and innovation? So all these are really important, and you can think of these as institutional capital. So there are four forms of capital that are necessary for creativity and innovation to happen. Three types of creativities and social processes for creativity. Now all of this, if this exists, can result in what we want to call as creative goods and services, right? So the question is, what are creative goods and services? And then we want to understand if and how they're different from other forms of goods and services that might exist. So what we want to think about is here, this is at the core of it, we have human creativity, Human creativity is the input, not humans as in isolation, but through a social process, and by leveraging the 4 forms of capital are creating goods and services. An example might be, there is a cluster where you're promoting a particular kind of weaving that has existed for many traditions, that knowledge exists. Maybe you're bringing in new technologies in that cluster to then generate economic activity to produce newer forms of weaving over there. So you're bringing your human capital, social capital, cultural capital all to bear to produce unique weaving products that probably appeal to the modern consumers, right? So input is human creativity, and the products that are created serve a purpose that is more than utility or just a functional use, right? They serve greater purpose. Deep down, they either trigger emotions, of connectivity. For example, for me, if I see a form of painting called as Madhubani, for me that triggers emotions of that place, a particular part in India which has a rich history and tradition, right? So a certain form of weaving can do the same for someone else. So these goods and services have a core value that they trigger values more than utility or commodity values, right? Often cultural goods and services, because at the core they have human creativity embedded in them, they have some kind of intellectual property that's attributable to individuals or groups of individuals. For example, in the case of this cluster, Madhubani painting, it comes from northeastern part of India, and it is attributed to generations of knowledge and tradition that existed in that part. So when we see Madhubani painting, you can almost think that that is intellectual property of that region, right? Where people have had it for a long time. And similarly, in more modern world, you can think of music and composers, and it's attributed to individuals and groups. So those are some characteristics that make cultural goods and services different than commodities that we normally have in our day-to-day lives. But they also have economic value embedded in them, right? They have the potential to generate economic value. They're not just good pieces of art that we hang and we all sort of walk into museums and see them, but they also have a core economic value. They have a cultural identity associated with them. And the fact is, these goods and services then form what we call as the core of the creative economy. Why is this important in some ways? Because what we are trying to do in some regards, we are trying to turn human creativity into impact to regions and geographies or places, right? And sometimes these are virtual communities. The way we think about these, if we want to really understand the impact, we start looking at, okay, so what is the economic impact of such creative activities? Simple way to measure is to say, if you cluster all of these into creative industries, what is the percentage of GDP that they form, right? Is it large, small? We don't know right now. We'll talk about it in a moment. But that's one way to think about the economic impact of creative goods and services. It's also important in terms of impact for a region because, if there is intellectual property like we talked about, then is a particular place actually bringing about higher number of patents or higher amount of intellectual property coming in there, which then can be attributed to that place and hence more economic returns for that place. But also I think creative goods and services often cause impact in terms of health and well-being of communities. And these are sort of, intangible benefits, but often we have to also think about, so how do we even think about it? What are those intangible benefits? So one way to think about the impact they are causing in a region is to start looking at the, how many lyrics have been written, how many films have been produced, and, how much of literature is being produced from certain regions. So there is some way to quantify these, although you cannot push it to the extreme of saying health and well-being. Just because a place has large number of lyrics coming from a place, can we say that that is the cause why that place is, people there are more satisfied? It's hard to establish that one-to-one connection, but there are enough studies that actually show that this contributes to the well-being of communities. So the question is then, if you look at creative goods and services and the industries which produce them. There is something unique about the industries that produce them, not just the goods and services, but overall. And what is unique about them compared to those industries that produce, let's say, commodity goods and services, or automotive industry for that matter, or telecommunication industry, right? The key thing is these cultural goods and services often tend to be project-based. They keep taking new shapes and forms each time because human creativity is at the core of it. Intellectual capital is at the core of it. Very rarely you will see that particular cultural goods and services have really extended lifespan. So you don't see that happening. So they're different in terms of how we think about them and how we measure them. They're based on knowledge-based activities, not necessarily limited to arts, which again can be measured, but also to deep cultural activities that happen in the form of festivals, for example, right? So they're different in that sense that they can take different shapes year to year, for example. They have intangible assets, like we talked about, and intangible values they create, which are hard to measure. And often cultural industries can be thought of as at the nexus or intersection of artisans who produce them, services, and industrialization. So there are components of all three of them that kind of come together, which is very different than what you see in other forms of industries. And it's known that this particular sector of the economy is sort of the most dynamic sector because it keeps changing, and even in the world trade, because the world trade and exchange is not yet formalized to the extent where we know we have uniform intellectual property rights and trade regulations can be set easily. So that's sort of something different about creative industries overall. So then how do we define what is a part of the creative industries and what is not, right? So United Nations Conference on Trade and Development came up with this framework in 2002 and collected data worldwide from different countries and put together a database. What we see here is they came up with 4 main clusters or types of creative industries: heritage, arts, media, functional creations, and 9 subgroups within them. If you go from top to bottom, the cultural value, that is the intangible value that is embedded in the goods and services created in that sector, cultural value diminishes as you go from top to bottom. That's one way to think about this framework. So those that relate to heritage, for example, cultural expressions like festivals and craft fairs kinds of things, or places like historical sites, and all trade and commerce that happens around that would come into the heritage sector. Arts, it's kind of easy to conceptualize: visual arts, performing arts, and of course everything that extends from those in terms of places or production related to performing arts. Media, print publishing media, audiovisual media comes as one group. And again, at the core of it, you have creators involved in print media. For example, you have literary, you have authors and curators who are curating material for publishing. And then on the other side, you have technology that enables publishing that happens, or the audiovisual media for that matter. And then you have the last one is kind of all holding category, which is the functional creations, which includes functional services. And I think for now, what kind of is taking roots is things such as agri-tourism, cultural tourism, place design, fashion design, jewelry design. They all fall into this category, including game design actually. It's thought of as a functional creation. So these are the industries that come into what are called as creative industries, culture and creative industries. People argue, is this right, wrong, why not why isn't sports over here, right? And there are alternative frameworks that sit there, but in this course we want to kind of follow this vocabulary as it is a lot more worldwide accepted. There's a lot more data behind this that we can examine and understand the contribution of creative industries to overall economy. So then why is the creative economy or creative industries, why are they important now where we stand? First of all, it contributes to 3% of world GDP. Now, is that big, small? Do we know? So if you look at most recent figures, I believe these are 2016 figures. It's about $2,250 billion worldwide. And that number, if you look at it, it's larger than the telecommunications sales worldwide put together. Or actually, it's larger than India's GDP. We now get a sense as to how big this industry might be. It has about 30 million people employed in this sector worldwide. The key thing is this particular sector has shown resilience. It's grown despite economic downturn. So if you look at the data from 2002 up until now, it has been on consistent rise. Some sectors within the creative economy have had a dip, but there are other sectors that have grown, and as a whole, it continues to grow. And it does have some large industries in it. For example, film, music, performing arts, by the way, in Germany is one of the largest components of the creative economy. Also, I think a phenomena that's unique now in the times that we are in this 21st century is worldwide there is a growing, expanding middle class. And middle class has larger hunger for culture and arts. And creative economy fulfills the need of that particular class. And I think what is important, and this report actually highlights that really well, is that creative economy has, or cultural industries have a place for what we call as the hand-skilled artisans, which in the industrialized world, what has happened is it has been replaced completely by technology, but this creative economy gives them a place and opportunity to engage in economic activity. And therefore, this is also seen as an approach to development, which is more useful for developing countries right now. And also in industrialized countries, there are regions that actually are still have high levels of poverty and have social issues. For these communities, this is seen as a way for inclusive and more sustainable development for the future. So great relevance for the times that we are in right now. And that is why I think all of us should really understand creative industries, particularly you, because you are in your lifetime, you will be running into creative industries. So the more you know about it, the more prepared you are to participate in the creative economy.